Have you ever looked at your grown children and wondered where the respect went? Maybe you've caught a sharp tone in their voice, or they brush off your advice like it doesn't matter anymore. It stings, doesn't it? You've spent years raising them, sacrificing sleep, time, and sometimes even your own dreams, only to feel like they've forgotten all of that now that they're adults. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. So many folks in their 60s, 70s, and beyond tell me they're facing the same heartache. But here's the good news. You don't have to just sit there and take it. There are ways to turn things around, to rebuild that respect and remind your kids of the bond you share. In this video, we're going to walk through 6 powerful steps you can take when your children don't respect you. Practical, down-to-earth ideas that can shift how they see you and how you feel about yourself too. Let's start with something that might surprise you. Looking at the mirror before you point the finger. I know it's easy to say, they're the ones being disrespectful. And maybe they are. But sometimes, the way we carry ourselves sets the stage for how others treat us, even our own kids. Think about it. Over the years, life changes us. Maybe you've gotten quieter, or you've stopped speaking up because you figure they won't listen anyway. I remember talking to a lady named Margaret, a sweet 68-year-old grandmother who'd always been the rock of her family. She told me her son started talking over her at every family dinner, like her opinion didn't count anymore. She'd shrunk into herself, letting it happen because she didn't want to make waves. But here's what she figured out, and it's the first thing you can do too: reclaim your voice. It's not about yelling or starting a fight. It's about showing them you're still here, still strong, and still worth hearing. Next time you're with your kids, try this. Sit up a little straighter, look them in the eye, and say what's on your mind, calmly but with confidence. Maybe it's something simple like, "I'd like to finish my thought," or, "I've got something to add here." It's a small step, but it sends a message. You respect yourself, and they should too. Margaret tried this at her next dinner, and her son actually paused, surprised, and listened. It didn't fix everything overnight, but it was a start. Now, that alone might not be enough, especially if things have been rocky for a while. So let's move into something a bit deeper: setting boundaries. I know that word gets thrown around a lot these days, but hear me out. It's not as complicated as it sounds. It's really just about deciding what you'll accept and what you won't, then sticking to it. Picture this. Your daughter snaps at you for asking about her day, or your son keeps canceling plans to visit at the last minute. It's tempting to let it slide. After all, you love them and you don't want to push them away. But every time you do, it's like you're telling them it's okay to treat you that way. I met a gentleman named Tom, 72, who'd had enough of his son showing up hours late to their weekly coffee meetups. If he showed up at all, Tom decided to draw a line. He told his son, "I love spending time with you, but I need you to call if you're running late. If you can't make it, let's reschedule." Simple, right? No anger, no guilt trips, just clear and firm. The first time his son flaked again, Tom didn't nag or chase him. He just went home, had his coffee, and waited. A week later, his son called to apologize and showed up on time after that. Boundaries aren't about punishment. They're about teaching people how to value you. Start small. Maybe it's asking them not to interrupt, or saying you won't answer the phone if they only call to complain. Whatever it is, mean it and follow through. Those first 2 steps, reclaiming your voice and setting boundaries, can really wake your kids up to the fact that you're not just background noise in their lives. They start to see you as a person again, not just mom or dad, who's always there no matter what. But sometimes it's not just about how you act, it's about how you connect. That brings us to listening, really listening to what's going on with them. I know it sounds backwards. They're the ones disrespecting me, why should I listen? But here's the thing. Respect goes both ways, and sometimes they're acting out because they feel unheard too. Take my friend Ellen, 65, whose daughter would roll her eyes every time Ellen tried to give advice about her grandkids. It drove Ellen nuts until she decided to flip the script. One day, instead of jumping in with her 2 cents, she asked her daughter, "What's been the hardest part of parenting for you lately?" Then she just listened, no fixing, no judging. Her daughter opened up about feeling overwhelmed, and for the first time in ages, they had a real conversation. Ellen told me it was like a wall came down. When you listen like that, you're not just waiting for your turn to talk, you're showing them you care about their world. Try it. Next time they're around, ask a question about something they're dealing with, then let them run with it. You might be amazed at how it softens things between you. So, we've talked about stepping up with your voice, drawing some lines and tuning into them. Those are solid places to start, and they can shift the air in the room more than you'd think. Now that we've got that foundation, let's move into something a little different. Showing them who you are outside of being their parent. Showing them who you are outside of being their parent can feel like a big leap, but it's simpler than you might think. By this point, your kids have probably known you as mom or dad for decades, and that role comes with a lot of baggage, good and bad. They might see you as the one who nagged them to clean their room or drove them to soccer practice, and somewhere along the way they stopped seeing the person behind all that. But you're more than just their parent. You've got passions, stories, and a life that's worth sharing. I was chatting with a guy named Harold, 70, who felt like his kids treated him like an old piece of furniture. There but not really noticed. He'd spent years tinkering in his garage, building little model planes, but his kids never asked about it. One day he invited his son over, not to talk about family stuff, but to show him this tiny Spitfire he'd just finished. He didn't make a big deal out of it, just handed him the plane and said, "Took me 3 weeks to get the wings right." His son's jaw dropped, and they ended up talking for hours about Harold's old hobby. That moment didn't just give them something new to connect over. It reminded his son that Harold was a guy with skills and a spark, not just dad. You can do this too. Maybe you love gardening, or you've got a knack for storytelling, or you've been secretly perfecting your pie crust for years. Don't wait for them to ask. Find a way to share it. Bring them into your world a little. It's not about bragging. It's about letting them see you as a whole person. When they do, they start to respect you for more than just what you've done for them. And while you're letting them peek into your life, there's something else that can really shake things up. Owning your mistakes. I know nobody likes admitting they were wrong, especially to their own kids. But hear me out, this isn't about groveling or digging up every little thing you feel guilty about. It's about showing them you're human, and that can build a bridge where respect's been shaky. Think back. Maybe you were too strict when they were younger, or you missed a game they really wanted you at, or maybe you've been short-tempered lately because life's been heavy. I remember a woman named Doris, 67, who'd had a falling out with her daughter over something small that blew up big. They hadn't talked in months, and Doris kept blaming her daughter's attitude. But one day she called her up and said, "I've been thinking, and I didn't handle that fight well. I got too stubborn, and I'm sorry." No excuses, no lecture, just straight from the heart. Her daughter didn't say much at first, but a week later she showed up with coffee and a hug. That apology didn't erase everything, but it cracked the door open. You don't have to overhaul your whole history, just pick one thing that's been nagging at you, something you know you could have done better, and own it. Say it simply, "I wasn't at my best back then, and I wish I'd handled it differently." It's not weakness, it's strength, and it shows them you're still growing. That's the kind of thing that earns respect without you even asking for it. Now, those two ideas, sharing your passions and owning your mistakes, work together to shift how your kids see you. They're not just reacting to the parent they've always known, they're meeting you anew. But there's one more piece I want to bring in here, and it's about consistency. You can't just try these things once and call it a day. Respect builds over time, and that means showing up the same way again and again. Take a guy like Frank, 74, whose son used to dismiss him as out of touch. Frank started small. He'd call every Sunday, not to nag or complain, but just to check in, maybe share a quick story about his week. At first, his son barely engaged, but Frank kept at it, steady as a heartbeat. After a few months, his son started calling back, even asking Frank's advice on little things. Why? Because Frank proved he wasn't going anywhere, and that reliability made his son take him seriously. It's not flashy, but it works. Pick something you can stick to. Maybe it's a weekly text, or showing up for their kids' events, or just being the one who listens when they're stressed. Keep it up, even if they don't notice right away. Consistency isn't loud, but it's powerful. It's like water wearing down a stone. They'll come around because they'll see you're not just talking about respect, you're living it. Those steps, showing them your life, owning your slip-ups and sticking with it, take what we started earlier and build on it. They're about meeting your kids where they are while reminding them who you are too. Next, we'll dive into how you can tie all this together and keep that respect growing strong. Tying all this together means taking everything we've talked about and making it part of how you live every day with your kids. By now, you've got a sense of how showing up with confidence, setting some clear lines, listening to them, sharing your own world, and even owning where you've stumbled can start to shift things. But the real magic happens when you weave those into something bigger, something that lasts. That brings us to celebrating their wins, no matter how small they seem. I know when you're feeling disrespected, it's hard to feel like cheering them on. But this isn't about pretending everything's perfect. It's about showing them you're still in their corner. I met a lady named Ruth, 69, whose son had been distant for years, barely calling unless he needed something. It grated on her, but one day she heard he'd fixed up an old car he'd been working on forever. Instead of waiting for him to bring it up, she texted him, "Heard about your car. Bet it looks amazing. Proud of you." No lecture, no guilt, just a little spark of recognition. He called her that night, excited to tell her all about it, and they talked longer than they had in ages. That small gesture didn't fix every rift, but it reminded him she cared about his life, not just what he owed her. Look for those moments with your own kids. Maybe they landed a new job, figured out a tricky recipe, or just got through a tough week. Call it out, even if it's just a quick, "Way to go." It shows them you're paying attention, and over time they'll start wanting to share more with you. That's respect growing roots. While you're lifting them up, there's one last piece that pulls it all together. Letting go of the need to control how they see you. This one's tough, especially if you've spent years trying to steer them the right way. But here's the truth, your kids are adults now and they're going to think what they think. You can't force respect out of them like you could force them to eat their veggies when they were 5. I remember talking to a man named George, 71, who was obsessed with getting his daughter to admit he'd been a good dad. Every conversation turned into him fishing for validation, and she just shut down. One day he decided to stop pushing. He focused on being himself, telling his jokes, sharing his fishing stories, showing up when she needed him, without demanding she give him a gold star. Slowly she started coming around, even laughing at his corny puns again. When you let go like that, you're not giving up, you're giving them room to choose respect on their own. It's like planting a seed and trusting it'll grow without yanking it up to check the roots. Keep being you, the best version of you, and let them figure out what that's worth. So, as we wrap this up, think about how these steps fit together. Reclaiming your voice and setting boundaries show them you're worth respecting. Listening and sharing your life build a connection that goes both ways. Owning your mistakes and staying consistent prove you're real and reliable. Celebrating their wins and letting go of control keep it all moving forward. You don't have to do everything at once. Start where it feels right for you and your kids. Maybe it's a quiet, "I'm sorry," next time you see them, or showing off that quilt you've been stitching. Small moves can ripple out in ways you don't expect, bringing back that warmth and regard you've been missing. You've got so much wisdom and love to share, and deep down they know it too. It's just a matter of helping them see it again. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What's worked for you with your kids, or what's been the hardest part to tackle? Every family's different, and your story might just help someone else watching. If you found this helpful, give it a thumbs up. It really helps us reach more folks who need it. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We're putting out more videos like this to help you live your fullest, happiest life, no matter your age. Here's to rebuilding those bridges with your kids and feeling that respect flow both ways again. You've got this. You've probably noticed by now that all these steps we've been talking about aren't just about changing how your kids act. They're about changing how you feel in the middle of it all too. When you start speaking up, drawing lines, and connecting in new ways, something shifts inside you. You start to feel stronger, more in charge of your own story. And that's where we're headed next. Letting that strength shine through by focusing on what you can control. Your own peace. I met a woman named Clara, 66, who'd spent years tying herself in knots over her son's sarcastic comments. Every jab felt like a personal attack, and she'd stew on it for days, wondering what she'd done wrong. But one afternoon, after another snarky remark, she decided she wasn't going to let it ruin her day. She went out to her porch, poured herself some tea, and sat there listening to the birds instead of replaying the argument in her head. It wasn't about ignoring her son, it was about choosing not to let his words steal her calm. You can do that too. Next time your daughter snaps or your son brushes you off, take a breath and ask yourself, What can I do right now to feel good anyway? Maybe it's taking a walk, calling a friend, or just sitting with a book you love. It's not running away, it's refusing to let their attitude dictate your mood. When they see you steady and unbothered, it's like a quiet signal that you're not here to be rattled. That kind of strength? It's magnetic, they can't help but notice it. And while you're holding on to your peace, there's something else that flows right out of that, showing them gratitude when they do get it right. I know when respect's been scarce, it's easy to focus on what's missing. But catching them in the good moments can turn the tide more than you'd think. Picture this. Your son finally calls just to chat, or your daughter thanks you for something small like that recipe you shared. Instead of letting it pass, say something like, "Hey, I really appreciate you checking in, it means a lot." It's simple but it's powerful. I was talking to a guy named Leonard, 73, who'd had a rocky stretch with his daughter. She'd been short with him for months. One day she dropped by with a coffee, unannounced, just to say hi. He could have shrugged it off, but instead he looked at her and said, "You didn't have to do that, but I'm glad you did, thanks." She smiled, a little surprised, and that tiny exchange opened the door to a better visit than they'd had in ages. When you spotlight those flickers of kindness, it's like watering a plant, you're encouraging more of it to grow. It doesn't mean you're glossing over the tough stuff. It just shows them you're paying attention to the good too. Try it next time they do something, anything, that feels like a step toward you. A little, "I'm grateful for that," can go further than a lecture ever will. Those two ideas, keeping your peace and giving thanks when it's due, build on everything else we've talked about. They're like the glue that holds it all together, keeping you steady while you nudge things forward with your kids. But there's one more thing I want to toss in here, and it's about leaning on time itself. I don't mean sitting back and hoping they'll magically come around, though sometimes they do, but trusting that these small moves you're making will stack up. Take a lady named Betty, 68, who felt like her kids had written her off as old news. She started mixing in some of what we've talked about, speaking up more, sharing bits of her life, even apologizing for a blowout from years back. At first it was like talking to a wall. But she kept at it, not pushing too hard, just letting it simmer. Months later, her son invited her to a barbecue. Nothing fancy, but he said, "I figured you'd like to see the grandkids." It wasn't a grand gesture, but for Betty, it was a sign that time was doing its work. You don't have to see results tomorrow. Keep showing up as the parent you want to be, confident, real, connected, and let those moments pile up. Time has a way of softening edges and bringing people back around, especially when they see you're not giving up on them or yourself. So, with your peace in your pocket, a little gratitude in your words, and time on your side, you're setting the stage for something lasting. It's about building a relationship where respect isn't just a word, it's how you live with each other. Next, we'll look at how to keep that going even when life throws a curveball or two. You've probably noticed by now that all these steps we've been talking about aren't just about changing how your kids act, they're about changing how you feel in the middle of it all too. When you start speaking up, drawing lines, and connecting in new ways, something shifts inside you. You start to feel stronger, more in charge of your own story. And that's where we're headed next. Letting that strength shine through by focusing on what you can control. Your own peace. I met a woman named Clara, 66, who'd spent years tying herself in knots over her son's sarcastic comments. Every jab felt like a personal attack, and she'd stew on it for days, wondering what she'd done wrong. But one afternoon, after another snarky remark, she decided she wasn't going to let it ruin her day. She went out to her porch, poured herself some tea, and sat there listening to the birds instead of replaying the argument in her head. It wasn't about ignoring her son, it was about choosing not to let his words steal her calm. You can do that too. Next time your daughter snaps or your son brushes you off, take a breath and ask yourself, what can I do right now to feel good anyway? Maybe it's taking a walk, calling a friend, or just sitting with a book you love. It's not running away, it's refusing to let their attitude dictate your mood. When they see you steady and unbothered, it's like a quiet signal that you're not here to be rattled. That kind of strength? It's magnetic, they can't help but notice it. And while you're holding on to your peace, there's something else that flows right out of that, showing them gratitude when they do get it right. I know when respect's been scarce, it's easy to focus on what's missing. But catching them in the good moments can turn the tide more than you'd think. Picture this. Your son finally calls just to chat, or your daughter thanks you for something small like that recipe you shared. Instead of letting it pass, say something like, "Hey, I really appreciate you checking in, it means a lot." It's simple, but it's powerful. I was talking to a guy named Leonard, 73, who'd had a rocky stretch with his daughter. She'd been short with him for months. One day she dropped by with a coffee, unannounced, just to say hi. He could have shrugged it off, but instead he looked at her and said, "You didn't have to do that, but I'm glad you did, thanks." She smiled, a little surprised, and that tiny exchange opened the door to a better visit than they'd had in ages. When you spotlight those flickers of kindness, it's like watering a plant, you're encouraging more of it to grow. It doesn't mean you're glossing over the tough stuff. It just shows them you're paying attention to the good too. Try it next time they do something, anything, that feels like a step toward you. A little, "I'm grateful for that," can go further than a lecture ever will. Those two ideas, keeping your peace and giving thanks when it's due, build on everything else we've talked about. They're like the glue that holds it all together, keeping you steady while you nudge things forward with your kids. But there's one more thing I want to toss in here, and it's about leaning on time itself. I don't mean sitting back and hoping they'll magically come around, though sometimes they do, but trusting that these small moves you're making will stack up. Take a lady named Betty, 68, who felt like her kids had written her off as old news. She started mixing in some of what we've talked about, speaking up more, sharing bits of her life, even apologizing for a blowout from years back. At first it was like talking to a wall. But she kept at it, not pushing too hard, just letting it simmer. Months later, her son invited her to a barbecue. Nothing fancy, but he said, "I figured you'd like to see the grandkids." It wasn't a grand gesture, but for Betty, it was a sign that time was doing its work. You don't have to see results tomorrow. Keep showing up as the parent you want to be, confident, real, connected, and let those moments pile up. Time has a way of softening edges and bringing people back around, especially when they see you're not giving up on them or yourself. So, with your peace in your pocket, a little gratitude in your words, and time on your side, you're setting the stage for something lasting. It's about building a relationship where respect isn't just a word, it's how you live with each other. Next, we'll look at how to keep that going even when life throws a curveball or two. Making this a part of your everyday life with your kids is really about turning all these ideas into something that feels natural, like a rhythm you don't even have to think about anymore. You've got this toolbox now, your voice, your calm, your gratitude, and it's not about using every tool every day but knowing they're there when you need them. It's like how you don't think twice about brewing your morning coffee after years of doing it. It just happens. I was chatting with a guy named Walter, 69, who'd been through the ringer with his daughter. She'd been dismissive for ages, but he'd started mixing in some of what we've talked about. Listening more, sharing his old woodworking projects, giving her space when she got prickly. At first, it felt like a checklist he had to keep up with, but over time, it just became how he was with her. One day, she called him up out of the blue to ask about a chair he'd fixed, and they ended up laughing about how he'd once glued his fingers together by accident. It wasn't a big moment, but it was easy, and that's the goal. Getting to a place where respect isn't a battle, but a quiet part of how you are together. You can start weaving this in too. Maybe it's slipping a "thanks for that" into a chat, or taking a breath instead of biting back when they're sharp. Little by little, it stops being work and starts being you. And while you're settling into that rhythm, there's something else that keeps it humming along. Letting them lead sometimes. I know we're used to being the ones in charge, deciding dinner, planning the holidays, but flipping that can do wonders. I met a lady named Grace, 71, who always felt like her son saw her as just mom, not someone he'd turn to for real talk. One weekend, she didn't call him with her usual, "What's the plan?" Instead, she waited. A few days later, he texted, "Hey, wanna come over and watch the game?" It wasn't her thing, football's never been her speed, but she said yes, grabbed some snacks and went. They ended up talking more about his work than the score, and she could tell he liked taking the wheel for once. It's not about handing over everything, it's about giving them a chance to invite you in. Next time you'd usually nudge them for a visit or a call, hold off a bit. Let them reach out, even if it's small, like asking your opinion on something random. When they do, go with it, show up, engage, let them steer. It's a subtle shift, but it tells them you trust them, and that trust has a way of pulling respect right back to you. Those two pieces, making it your everyday and letting them lead, set you up for something that sticks. But there's one last thing I want to leave you with, and it's about savoring the little wins along the way. It's easy to keep your eyes on the big picture, wanting that perfect, respectful relationship, but the small stuff is where the heart of it lives. Think about a guy named Ed, 68, who'd felt invisible to his daughter for years. He started showing up differently, steady, open himself, and one day she left a voicemail just to say, "I was thinking about that story you told me about Grandpa. Tell me another one sometime." It wasn't a grand apology or a hallmark moment, but to Ed, it was gold. He didn't need her to say, "I respect you." That message was her saying it without words. Keep an eye out for those with your own kids. Maybe it's a laugh you share, a good to see you they toss out, or even just them lingering a little longer when they visit. Don't brush those off, hold on to them. They're signs you're getting through, and they add up to something bigger than you might realize. So, as you fold all this into your days, making it natural, letting them take the lead, and treasuring those quiet victories, you're building something that's not just about respect, but about a bond that feels good for both of you. It's a long game, sure, but it's worth every step. Next, we'll wrap it up and talk about how to keep this alive for the long haul, no matter what's around the bend. Keeping this alive for the long haul, no matter what's around the bend, is about trusting the groundwork you've laid and letting it carry you forward. You've got this way of being with your kids now, steady, open, real, and it's not something you have to start over with every time you see them. It's more like a river that keeps flowing even when the weather changes. Life's going to keep throwing stuff at you, maybe they move farther away or you've got your own health to think about, but what you've built here can flex with all of that. I was talking to a woman named Lillian, 73, who'd finally gotten to a good place with her son after years of feeling like he didn't care. They'd started chatting more, laughing over old memories, and then he got a job across the country. She worried it'd all fall apart again, but she kept it simple. Sent him a text every now and then, shared a picture of her garden, didn't push too hard. He'd reply when he could, sometimes with a photo of his new place, and they kept that thread going. It wasn't the same as having him nearby, but it worked because she didn't let distance undo what they'd started. You can do that too. Whatever changes come, big moves, busy schedules, whatever, keep the little touches alive. A quick, "miss you," or a funny story keeps that river running, and they'll feel it even miles away. And while you're keeping that connection warm, there's something else that makes it stick for the long run. Forgiving the past, not just theirs but yours too. I know we've talked about owning your mistakes, but this is deeper. It's letting go of the weight you might still carry about how things went when they were growing up. Maybe you feel like you weren't there enough, or you wish you'd been softer when they needed it. I met a guy named Henry, 70, who'd always beaten himself up over working late when his daughter was little. She'd grown up fine, but he could tell she held a quiet grudge, and he held one too, against himself. One day he brought it up, not to fish for forgiveness but to let it out. He said, "I wish I'd made it home for more bedtimes. I was trying to do right by you, but I missed some things." She didn't say much, just nodded, but later she hugged him a little longer than usual. Forgiving yourself isn't just for you, it's for them too. It clears the air, makes room for what's now. Think about something you've carried, maybe a regret, a harsh word, and let it go. You don't have to say it out loud, but if it fits, tell them, "I wasn't perfect and I'm okay with that now." It's like dropping a stone you've been lugging around. They'll feel the lightness too, and it'll keep you close. Those two, staying connected through the shifts and letting go of old baggage, set you up for a bond that doesn't fade. But there's one more piece to lock it in for the long haul, and it's about dreaming a little together. I don't mean big, wild plans, though if that's your style, go for it, but finding something to look forward to with them. I was talking to a lady named Vera, 68, whose son used to treat their visits like a chore. She'd been working on all this, showing up as herself, giving him space, and then she threw out a casual idea. What if we took the grandkids to the coast next summer? Nothing fancy, just a day by the water. He lit up, started talking about the last time they'd gone as a family, and suddenly they had a shared spark. It wasn't about the trip itself, it was about giving them something to aim for together. You can try that too. Toss out a small dream, maybe a picnic, a movie night, even just let's cook that old recipe sometime. It doesn't have to happen tomorrow, but it plants a seed they can hold on to. It's a way of saying, we've got more ahead, and that pulls respect into the future with you. So, as you carry this forward, keeping the thread alive, forgiving what's behind, and dreaming a bit together, you're not just holding on to respect, you're growing something that'll last. It's yours to nurture through whatever comes next, and it's stronger than you might think. Next, we'll bring it all home and talk about why this matters not just for them but for you too. Bringing it all home really comes down to why this matters, not just for how your kids treat you but for how you feel about yourself as you walk through these years. You've put so much into this, showing up with your voice, keeping your peace, building that bond, and it's not just about getting them to nod and say, yes, Mom, or sure, Dad. It's about knowing you've done everything you can to keep that connection alive, and that's a gift you give yourself too. I was talking to a woman named Marie, 72, who'd spent years feeling like her son saw her as a nag or a burden. She started trying these things, listening more, sharing her love for birdwatching, letting go of old guilt, and bit by bit he softened. But what struck her most wasn't just that he called more often, it was that she felt lighter, prouder of who she was with him. She told me, I used to think it was all on him to fix this, but now I see it's about me too. I like who I am when we talk. That's the heart of it. As you keep this going, you're not just chasing their respect. You're earning your own, and that feels good deep down where it counts. And while you're carrying that pride, there's something else this does for you. It keeps you young, not in some cheesy fountain of youth way, but in how it keeps your spirit moving. I met a guy named Sam, 75, who'd felt like his daughter wrote him off as done once he hit his 70s. He didn't want that to be his story, so he leaned into all this, stayed steady, shared his old jazz records, dreamed up a little road trip with her. She didn't just start seeing him differently, he started feeling different. He'd catch himself smiling more, humming a tune while he watered his plants, because he wasn't just sitting back waiting for life to happen. He was in it. You can feel that too. Every time you reach out with a story or laugh over something small with them, it's like a spark that keeps you lit up. It's not about turning back the clock, it's about living right now, fully with them. Next time you're with your kids, notice how it feels when they engage even a little. That's not just them coming around, that's you staying alive in the best way. So, as we tie this up, let's think about what you're walking away with. You've got a way to stand tall, to connect, to let go of what's heavy, and to keep it rolling through whatever's next. It's not a quick fix, nothing real ever is, but it's a path you can trust. You're not just doing this for them, you're doing it for you, for the peace of knowing you've given it your all, and for the joy of feeling that bond hum again. I'd love to hear how it's going for you. Drop a comment and tell me what's clicked, or what's still tricky. Your story might just light the way for someone else watching. If this hit home, give it a like. It helps us reach more folks who could use it. And hit that subscribe button, we've got more coming to keep you thriving no matter the years. Here's to you, to your kids, and to a respect that runs both ways, strong, steady, and yours to keep. Please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you so much.